A millionaire got married on a bet with the company's ugly intern. On their wedding night, he couldn't believe what she was going to do to him. James Harris was the center of attention at the luxurious annual party held by the Harris Corporation, hosted at the Presidente Intercontinental Hotel in New York. Amid champagne glasses and strategic conversations, he moved with the confidence of someone who ruled everything around him. Partners, investors, and employees surrounded him, showering him with praise and trying to capture a moment of his attention. To him, it was just another predictable night. Beside him, Robert Mitchell, his best friend and business partner, observed the scene with a playful smile. "Another perfect party to feed your ego," Robert teased, taking a sip of whiskey. James chuckled, not bothering to deny it. He was used to winning, both in business and in life. "And what's wrong with that?" "Nothing," Robert smiled before subtly gesturing toward a corner of the room. "But what about her?" James followed his friend's gaze and spotted Sarah Davis, a modest intern from the administrative department. She held a glass of juice, clearly out of place among the surrounding luxury. Her simple dress drew no attention, and her large glasses kept sliding down her nose. Yet it was evident that her gaze occasionally lingered on James, admiring him from afar without daring to approach. "What about her?" James asked, disinterested. "I bet you can't win her over," Robert challenged, now with a mischievous smile. "How about marrying her? I bet you don't have the guts." James let out a short laugh, finding the idea absurd. "That would be too easy." "Easy? You always go for women who already know they'll fall at your feet. But this one? She's different. She doesn't look like the type who surrenders so quickly." James narrowed his eyes. He liked challenges, and Robert knew that. "How much do you want to bet?" $200,000. James studied Sarah for a moment. She seemed naive, romantic. This bet was ridiculously simple. He grabbed a napkin from the table, scribbled some words on it, and signed his name. "In less than a month, this woman will be living in my house as my wife." Robert laughed, accepting the challenge. The game had begun. The next day, unaware of the gamble behind it, Sarah saw her fate change when James suddenly appeared at her desk at work. "Sarah, right?" he asked, flashing a charming smile. She blinked, surprised. James Harris knew her name. Yes, Mr. Harris." "James," he corrected. "I've noticed your work. You have talent." Sarah blushed, taken aback by the compliment. "Thank you. I work hard." "I can tell," he said, leaning slightly toward her. "How about we talk more tonight? Dinner?" Sarah's heart skipped a beat. Was this real? James Harris was asking her to dinner? Without hesitating, she answered, "Yes, I'd love to." James smiled. First move made. The day dragged on for Sarah Davis. Since the morning, her mind had been dominated by a single thought. James Harris had invited her to dinner. The simple fact that he, a man so powerful and inaccessible, wanted to spend time with her was unbelievable. At work, every furtive glance he cast her way made her heart race. When the workday ended, she rushed home, eager to get ready. Sarah opened her small wardrobe and analyzed her options. Her style had always been modest, nothing too flashy. After a moment of indecision, she chose a simple navy blue dress that complemented her fair skin and brown hair. She tied her hair into a low bun and put on a small pair of earrings. She wasn't stunning like the women surrounding James, but she felt beautiful. And that was enough. Just before 8, a black luxury car stopped in front of her building. The driver got out and opened the rear door for her. Sarah took a deep breath before stepping in. She was nervous but excited. Her innocent heart believed that tonight would mark the beginning of something special. When they arrived at the restaurant, the sophisticated ambiance enveloped her. It was the most elegant place she had ever been. Huge chandeliers hung from the ceiling, casting golden light over the well-set tables. The voices of the guests were low and refined, as if everyone there shared a secret. James stood up to greet her by a reserved table. As always, he was impeccably dressed in a dark suit that fit his frame perfectly. When he saw her, he smiled warmly, a trained and seductive smile. "You look stunning," he said, pulling out the chair for her. The compliment completely disarmed her. "Thank you," she replied, feeling her cheeks redden. The first few minutes were filled with a mixture of anticipation and nervousness. Sarah felt like she was in a dream, and James, for his part, played his role masterfully. He looked her in the eye as he spoke, asked questions about her life, showed genuine interest in her dreams and ambitions. Everything was part of the game he had started. "Tell me more about yourself, Sarah," he said, leaning on the table. "What brought you to Harris Corporation?" She hesitated for a moment, then began to speak. She told him about her childhood, how she had always struggled to study and reach where she was. Her voice carried emotion as she spoke of her mother, the person who had supported her the most. James listened attentively, nodding at the right moments, pretending to be enchanted. "You're amazing," he said when she finished. Sarah smiled, enchanted. He seemed to really see her in a way no one ever had. The evening flowed with conversations, laughter, and glances that, to her, seemed meaningful. When James briefly held her hand, she felt a shiver run through her skin. This man, so unattainable, was here close, interested in her. At the end of dinner, he walked her to the car. "I really enjoyed tonight," she said, her eyes shining. James gently cupped her chin, gazing into her eyes. "So did I." Without kissing her, without rushing anything, he simply smiled before stepping back. It was enough to leave her in ecstasy. In the days that followed, James maintained the facade with mastery. Flowers arrived on her desk every morning. Loving messages popped up on her phone. He would walk by the administrative department just to greet her, inventing excuses to be near her. When he showed up during lunch, saying he wanted to take her out for something special, Sarah's heart would race. Never in her life had she been courted like this. She was completely caught up, diving deeper into this dream. Then, one special night arrived. The sky was clear and starry when James took her to dinner on a private terrace. The setting was lit only by candles, and the soft city breeze blew gently. Sarah had never felt so special. After dinner, he led her to the edge of the terrace, where the city lights shimmered below them. James took her hands and sighed deeply, as though hesitant. "I've never met someone like you, Sarah," he said, his voice sounding sincere. "Since the moment I saw you, I felt something different. You make me want to be a better man." Sarah felt tears fill her eyes. "James." He then took a small box from his pocket and, without further hesitation, opened it. "Will you marry me?" Sarah's hands went to her mouth in shock. Her heart raced. Was this real? She felt like it was. She felt like everything had led to this moment. "Yes," she said, tears falling. James smiled, slipping the ring on her finger. The wedding happened quickly. Sarah didn't want to wait. James, on the other hand, was eager to wrap it up once and for all. No party, no guests, just signatures at the registry office. For her, it was the happiest day of her life. For him, it was just another step toward winning the bet. The next day, Sarah arrived at James's mansion. She had never seen anything like it. The luxury was intimidating, but she was determined to adapt. This, she told herself, would be the home where she'd build her new life alongside the man she loved. But what came next was not what she had imagined. In the first few days, James was present but soon began to pull away. He left early and came back late. He avoided any displays of affection. Sarah tried to get closer, but only received monosyllabic replies. She made dinners, tried to create moments together, but James seemed indifferent, as if now that they were married there was no need to pretend anymore. Slowly, the fairy tale was turning into a prison. If you're watching this far, I'm sure you're liking it, so I want to ask you to subscribe to the channel. The euphoria of the wedding faded faster than Sarah had imagined. In the first few days at the mansion, she tried to ignore the signs. James's growing distance, his curt responses, and the long hours he spent away. He's just getting used to the new life together, she told herself. It's only a matter of time before he opens up. But days turned into weeks, and nothing changed. Soon, Sarah realized she was practically living alone. James would leave in the morning before she woke up and return late at night, when she was almost asleep. He never told her where he was going, never asked if she needed anything. He showed no interest in her presence. He didn't take her to company events, didn't invite her to dinner, and didn't even share a meal with her in their own home. It was as though she was a shadow, an irrelevant detail in his routine. The nights were the hardest. Sarah tried to wait for him, but the hours dragged on, and often sleep would overtake her on the couch, where she slept hugging a pillow. When she woke up, James had already gone straight to the bedroom, oblivious to the fact that she had been waiting for him. The emptiness of the house, so large and cold, became unbearable. The loneliness weighed on her shoulders more than ever. In an attempt to fill the void that separated them, Sarah began making small gestures. She wanted James to notice that someone was by his side, someone who cared. Every morning, she would wake up early to prepare breakfast, setting the table with care. She'd put flowers in the center, make toast, and freshly squeezed juice. But James was never there to eat. When he came down already late, he would just grab a cup of coffee and leave without looking back. She started leaving little notes next to his bed. "Hope you have an amazing day. If you need anything, I'm here. Good night, James." The notes would always be there in the morning, untouched. On weekends, she tried suggesting movies for them to watch together, but he would always say he was tired or had something more important to do. If she insisted, he would simply ignore her. Every failed attempt was an invisible wound opening inside her. One night, after another full day of waiting for him, Sarah watched the clock strike almost midnight. James still hadn't arrived. She called his phone, but it went straight to voicemail. Where was he? Who was he with? When she finally heard the door open, it was already past 1 in the morning. James came in slowly, tossing his keys on the table. Sarah stood up from the couch, her chest tight. "James, we need to talk." He sighed, clearly exhausted, without even looking at her. "Not now, Sarah. I'm drained." "Now, yes!" She raised her voice, surprising even herself. Her heart was racing. "I spend the whole day alone in this house, waiting for you, but you're never here, never want to talk. What did I do wrong?" James rubbed his face impatiently. "Sarah, for heaven's sake." "I'm your wife." Her voice broke. "You treat me like I don't even exist." He finally looked at her, his gaze cold, emotionless. "Because I never asked to marry. I just did." Sarah gasped for air. The sting of his words hit her like a punch to the stomach. James turned his gaze away and started heading up the stairs, leaving her there, frozen, destroyed. As he disappeared into the bedroom, Sarah felt tears streak down her face. She went up to her own room, the one James had never shared with her, and threw herself on the bed. She hugged a pillow and cried until she had no strength left. She wondered how everything had changed so quickly. Where was the man who had once said he was enchanted by her? Where were the smiles, the sweet words, the touches? She still wanted to believe there was a chance, that maybe, somehow, she could make James see her again. The next morning, she made a decision. She would prepare a special dinner. She bought fresh ingredients, chose an expensive wine, and spent the entire day planning. She set the table with candles, served the food on fine china, and waited. When James arrived that evening, he found the scene set. Sarah, with a hopeful smile, dressed especially for him. The steaming food, the wine poured, an intimate, cozy atmosphere. He stopped for a moment, surprised. His eyes scanned the details before finally landing on her, and for the first time, James felt a twinge of guilt. It wasn't love, not yet. But for a moment, he realized that this woman wasn't just someone he shared a house with. She truly cared for him. Sarah noticed the hesitation in his gaze and felt a flicker of hope. The weeks passed, and Sarah continued trying. Even after all the disappointments, after all the nights spent alone, she didn't give up. She didn't want to. Her innocent heart still believed that somewhere behind James's coldness, there was a man capable of love. She didn't ask for much. She didn't want expensive dinners, luxurious gifts, or passionate declarations. She just wanted to be seen, to be heard. She wanted him to notice her existence, and unexpectedly, the first sign appeared. One afternoon, James was in the office at the mansion, answering emails and reviewing reports. Sarah walked in silently, holding a cup of coffee. He worked so much that he probably didn't remember the last time he'd stopped to eat something. "I brought coffee for you," she said, placing the cup beside him. James didn't even look up from the screen. "Thanks." Sarah sighed. He didn't change. She sat down in a nearby armchair, determined not to let it affect her. "You work so much that if you ever disappear, they'll find you collapsed over the keyboard," she joked, trying to lighten the mood. "The work demands it," he responded flatly. "What really demands it is you pushing yourself too hard," she retorted, crossing her arms. James finally looked up from the computer and stared at her, about to snap back. But Sarah did something he didn't expect. She grabbed one of the papers on his desk and looked at him seriously. "Let me see if I understand. Harris Corporation is making absurd profits from the recent deals, but you still work like you're bankrupt." James raised an eyebrow, confused. "What are you doing?" "Trying to understand this logic. Are you hiding money under the mattress, scared to spend it? If you need help, I can teach you how to shop." She said this with a serious expression, but her tone was playful. Before he could stop himself, James laughed. It was genuine, spontaneous. Sarah froze. He had realized too late what he had done and cleared his throat, returning his attention to the computer. But that moment, no matter how small, didn't go unnoticed. Sarah saw it. James laughed, and for a second she felt like she had broken through an invisible barrier. After that day, James started noticing things he had previously ignored. Little details. The way Sarah cared for him. The way she put effort into keeping the house cozy. How she always tried to make him laugh, even when he didn't react. He started noticing that she knew how to listen, that she didn't force her presence, that she respected his silence without it meaning she didn't care. One evening, James came home earlier than usual. He found Sarah sitting on the couch, a blanket covering her legs, watching a movie. "Do you like these movies?" he asked, dropping his briefcase on the table. She turned, surprised that he was speaking to her without her having to initiate the conversation. "I do. It's a classic comedy." James thought for a moment. He walked over to the couch and, to her surprise, sat down beside her. "Have you seen it?" Sarah asked, trying to hide the joy of having him there. "No." "Then watch it with me. I want to see if you're capable of really laughing." James looked at her with mock indignation. "You think I don't know how to laugh? After living with you for so long, I'm starting to suspect that you don't." He gave her a crooked smile. Something inside him was changing. The days that followed brought small surprises. The dinners that were once silent now had occasional conversations. Breakfast, which he had ignored before, was now shared every now and then. James didn't look away as much when Sarah smiled at him. Then, one weekend, he did something even he didn't expect. He invited her to go out. Sarah blinked, incredulous. "You want to go out with me?" James cleared his throat, as if trying to downplay that it had been his idea. Yes. But why? He hesitated. He didn't even know why himself, but he knew he wanted to see her happy. That afternoon, they walked through a park in downtown. Sarah was radiant. They bought ice cream, sat on a bench, and talked about simple things. She told funny stories from her childhood, and James listened, really listened. That was the first time he was truly there, with her. On the way back home that evening, Sarah smiled at him before heading up the stairs to her room. "Thank you for today." He simply nodded. But when she disappeared down the hallway, James found himself reflecting on his own actions. Why had he done that? Something inside him was changing, and he knew it. The problem was, he didn't know what to do with it. In the following days, he began to notice more about her. The little details, the way she casually tied her hair when she was focused, the sparkle in her eyes when she spoke about something she loved, the softness in her voice when she said something kind. And without realizing it, he no longer pulled away when she hugged him. That night, while they were sitting on the balcony of the house, Sarah shared a dream she had. Something silly, but that made her laugh by herself. James watched her closely, and then, without thinking, he held her hand. Sarah was surprised, but didn't say anything. Her heart hammered in her chest, and she allowed herself to simply feel that moment. James took time to realize what he had done. When he did, he didn't let go. Maybe, just maybe, he was beginning to see her in a different light. James Harris didn't immediately realize that something inside him was changing. It was subtle, almost imperceptible, like a breeze turning into wind before anyone even notices the difference. But it happened. In the first months of marriage, he saw her as a nuisance, a burden he'd have to carry temporarily until his bet was fully won. But now, without planning or allowing it, his perception of Sarah had shifted. She no longer seemed clumsy or awkward to him. On the contrary, he started to notice the details he had previously ignored. The way she tied her hair absent-mindedly when she was focused. The sound of her spontaneous laughter when watching an old comedy. The lightness with which she treated people, without ulterior motives, asking for nothing in return. Sarah was different from every other woman he had known, and that intrigued him. Every day with her became easier. Being around her was no longer a burden. On the contrary, James began to feel comfortable with her presence, and that realization frightened him. When had she stopped being just a game? Trying to understand what he felt, James decided to test himself. He needed distance to evaluate what was really happening inside of him. "What do you think about us traveling to Boston this weekend?" he asked one morning as they had breakfast together, something that had quietly become a routine between them. Sarah's eyes widened, surprised. "Travel? The two of us?" He nodded casually. "I need to take care of some business there, and I thought you could come along." Sarah's heart raced. He wanted to spend time with her. Even if it was just for business, it was unexpected. "I'd love to," she replied, trying to contain her excitement. That weekend, they left for Boston. The atmosphere in the car was different from the other trips they'd taken before, when James had remained silent, immersed in his own thoughts. This time, he conversed. He wanted to know more about Sarah's stories, her preferences, her childhood memories. She, in turn, spoke freely, enjoying every second of the attention she never expected. Over the days in the city, James found himself watching her more than he would care to admit. The sparkle in her eyes when she tried something new, the carefree smile when they walked through the charming streets of the city. He realized that he missed her when they were apart. In the hotel, when he had to leave for a meeting, he came back and noticed that the room felt colder without her presence. It was a shock to realize he enjoyed her company. On the last night of the trip, after dinner, they went to the hotel terrace. The sky was clear, filled with stars. The night air was cool, and Sarah hugged her arms to shield herself from the chill. James looked at her and felt something strange in his chest. It wasn't guilt, nor was it regret. It was something deeper, something he couldn't yet name. "Do you miss your old life?" he asked, unsure of why he wanted to know the answer. Sarah looked at him, surprised. "Sometimes," she admitted honestly, "but I never regretted marrying you." He turned his gaze toward the stars. Sarah didn't know, but those words affected him more than they should have. For a brief moment, he wanted to kiss her. The desire came from a place that had nothing to do with the bet, with pride, or with the game. But he hesitated. Sarah, in turn, sensed something different in his gaze, something she had never seen before. Her heart swelled with hope, but she remained silent, respecting that moment. When they returned home that night, the silence between them wasn't uncomfortable anymore. James was confused, lost in thoughts. Something inside him was telling him that nothing would ever be the same. And then, that very night, without planning it, he did something that would change everything. When Sarah was about to head upstairs to her room, James gently grabbed her arm. She turned to face him, confused. "James?" He hesitated for a second, then kissed her, but this time it wasn't a fake kiss. It wasn't part of the game. It wasn't an obligation. It was intense, real, filled with feelings he still didn't fully understand. Sarah immediately felt the difference. He wasn't just pretending, he wanted her. When they pulled away, her eyes were filled with tears. "What was that?" she whispered. James didn't answer, because he didn't know either. But in that moment, he understood something. He didn't want to be away from her anymore. After that night, things between them changed. He started to protect her, defend her, take care of her in ways he never had before. Small gestures came naturally, holding her hand while crossing the street, placing his coat over her shoulders when she felt cold, making sure she was comfortable. James had never been a man of many words, but his actions started speaking for him. Sarah, not fully understanding what was happening, simply enjoyed every second of the love that was blooming. The days felt different. James realized this in the subtlest details. Before, his routine had been rigid, cold, predictable. Now, the morning started with the aroma of fresh coffee, the soft sound of Sarah's voice, and the sunlight pouring through the mansion's windows in a way he had never noticed. She brought color to a life that had once been only gray. It wasn't anything grand or dramatic. It was simple, but important. They had breakfast together, and James found himself looking forward to that moment. Sarah liked to spread jelly on his toast, laughing when he tried to dodge it. He, who had once been so methodical, began to allow these small detours, these moments of relaxation. In the late afternoons, they walked through the garden. In the beginning, Sarah had insisted on holding his hand. Now, it was James who sought her hand first. Sometimes after dinner, they would sit on the balcony, watching the city far below. Sarah would talk about trivial things, and James would simply listen, really listen. And without realizing it, he started laughing more, talking more, feeling more. One night, while they were watching a movie in the living room, James realized something. He had never been so happy with anyone. But it wasn't just the routine that had changed. James started noticing Sarah differently. At the start of their marriage, she had seemed like a fragile, out-of-place girl, always insecure around him. Now, there was something different about her. One day, while getting dressed to go out, he watched her through the reflection in the mirror. She was trying on a new dress, adjusting the waist with a critical look. Yes, she had lost a little weight, but that wasn't what made him stop. What truly caught his attention was the confidence in her posture. Sarah was no longer the shy woman who had once walked into his house. Now, there was a firmness in the way she moved, a different sparkle in her eyes. And James realized it wasn't the dress, it wasn't the change in her body. It was the effect she had on him. She filled the empty spaces he never knew he had. He didn't say anything, but that night, as they lay side by side in bed, he didn't sleep. He watched her, thinking about how much he had changed, thinking about what he was feeling. Sarah noticed this too. She saw that James was no longer the distant, cold man who avoided her. He was looking at her in a different way. There was something there that hadn't existed before. And then, it happened. "What's wrong?" she asked, feeling his gaze on her. James hesitated for a moment, but this time he didn't pull away. "I love you." Sarah held her breath. For a moment, she thought she was dreaming. "What?" "I love you," he repeated firmly. Her eyes filled with tears. "Are you sure?" James took her hand. "For the first time in my life, I'm sure of something." Sarah couldn't hold back her tears, but this time, they were tears of happiness. From that moment on, nothing was the same. James completely surrendered. The man who had once bet against his own heart was now Sarah's. And for the first time, he was exactly where he wanted to be. This year's Harris Corporation party had a special meaning for Sarah and James. It was the first time they attended together as husband and wife. A year had passed since their story began, and now they were there, hand in hand, smiling at each other, completely in love. Sarah felt radiant. She remembered when she had been in that same ballroom, in a discreet corner, just a meaningless intern. Now, she stood next to James, wearing an elegant dress, being introduced to influential businessmen and important figures from the corporate world. But none of this mattered as much as the happiness she felt. James, in turn, seemed different as well. He, who had once viewed the event merely as a strategic formality, now allowed himself to enjoy it. He looked at Sarah with pride, happy to have her by his side. She was his, and he was hers. For a moment, Sarah thought that night would be perfect, but destiny was about to shatter everything. While she chatted animatedly with some executives' wives, James stepped away to grab a drink. It was then that he heard a voice he hadn't heard in a long time. "So how has it been living with your bet prize for a year?" James froze. The glass in his hand hovered in the air. He recognized that sarcastic tone. It was Robert Mitchell. He slowly turned and saw his old friend standing there, a mocking smile on his face. "What did you say?" James asked, his voice steady, but his chest already tightening with a bad feeling. Robert laughed, swirling the whiskey in his glass. "Come on, James. Don't tell me you forgot. It was exactly at this party 1 year ago that you accepted my ridiculous bet. And look how it turned out. You married her. The game really turned, huh?" James felt his stomach drop. The last thing he wanted was to address that topic. "This is not funny," he said, lowering his tone. "Of course it is," Robert continued, oblivious to the tension on James's face. "The little naive intern who became your wife for a whim. I bet it was fun at the beginning to see how she believed every word you said." James closed his eyes for a second. This conversation shouldn't be happening. Then, a detail cut through his thoughts like a knife. The silence around them. He felt a cold shiver run down his spine. Robert had spoken too loudly. His words hung in the air like an irreversible sentence, and when James turned around, his worst fear was confirmed. Sarah was there. She had heard everything. The champagne glass in her hand was tilted, as if she had forgotten about it. Her wide eyes were fixed on James, but they no longer saw him the same way. There was pain. There was betrayal. "Sarah," James began, but his voice came out weak, choked by guilt. She took a step back, then another. The ground beneath her seemed to vanish. Robert's words echoed in her head. "Your bet prize." The marriage had started as a game, a cruel joke, a lie. Everything they had shared, every glance, every touch, every promise, it had all been a lie. Sarah felt her heart race with so much pain, it felt like it was breaking in her chest. "No!" she whispered, her voice cracking. "Sarah, listen to me." James tried to approach, but she stepped back, tears already threatening to fall. The party around them seemed to disappear. It was just her and the overwhelming truth that suffocated her. And then Sarah ran. She turned and hurried toward the exit, ignoring the curious looks and confused voices around her. When she couldn't breathe anymore, she started running. She needed to get away. She needed to escape. James stood frozen for a second, the shock paralyzing him. But when he regained his senses, he ran after her. He found her outside the ballroom, in the garden illuminated by soft lights. She was crying. "Sarah." He grabbed her arm, trying to stop her. "Please, listen to me." She turned around quickly, her face marked with tears. Her eyes were filled with pain and fury. "Let me go, James. I can explain." Sarah laughed, but it wasn't a laugh of humor. It was a laugh of desperation, of disbelief. "Explain what? That it was all a game? That I was just a trophy for your ego? That you never loved me?" James felt as though each of her words cut him to the core. "It's not like that. It's not like that anymore." She shook her head, incredulous. "Then tell me, when did it stop being a bet? When did I stop being a prize and become someone you respect?" James opened his mouth but had no answer. He didn't know what to say. His silence was all Sarah needed to feel her heart shatter. She took a deep breath, trying to hold back the sobs threatening to escape. "I loved you, James. I really did." He held her face in his hands, desperate. "And I love you. I love you, Sarah. Please believe me." She closed her eyes for a moment, as if wanting to believe, as if part of her still wished this wasn't true. But it wasn't that simple. When she opened her eyes again, there was only sadness. "I can't stay with someone who saw me as a game." And then she pulled away. James watched her turn and walk away. And for the first time in his life, he felt like he was losing something he would never be able to get back. The night was cold and silent when James arrived home. For the first time, that mansion, so large and imposing, felt empty, lifeless. He entered and closed the door behind him, feeling the unbearable weight of Sarah's absence. Her scent was still there, on the couch, the sheets, the coffee cup she used every morning, but she was no longer there. And maybe she never would be again. James ran his hand over his face, exhausted. He slowly climbed the stairs, as if each step was a confirmation of what he had lost. Upon entering the bedroom, he saw the bed still made, just as she had left it before they went to the party. He threw himself on the mattress, staring at the dark ceiling. Sarah was gone. There was no doubt, and it was all his fault. The pain came like a sharp blow to the chest. Never in all his life had James felt like this. Not in the worst moments of his journey, not in the face of his greatest business defeats, because this was the first time he had lost something that truly mattered. The night was long and cruel. Sleep didn't come. The silence of the house seemed to mock him. For the first time, James felt truly alone. In the morning, when he grabbed his phone, he found a short and cold message. "I want a divorce." His body stiffened. He read the words again, as if the meaning could change with each reading. But it didn't change. Sarah wanted to erase everything they had lived. James tried to call, but the calls went straight to voicemail. He sent messages, but there was no response. She had completely shut him out. On impulse, he grabbed the car keys and drove to the apartment where she was staying with a friend. When he arrived, he didn't have the courage to leave the car. He stayed there, parked, watching the light on in the window. She was inside, probably crying, probably hating him. And James had never hated himself more than that night. The following days were a torment. He tried everything to get closer. He sent flowers, letters, desperate messages. He waited at the door of her work, but Sarah walked past without even looking at him. Each rejection was another stab, each silence, a sentence that he had lost her forever. But he couldn't accept that. It was then that he made a drastic decision. If everything he had built in life meant nothing without Sarah, then he no longer needed any of it. That week, James called a meeting with the company's shareholders. The conference room was packed when he entered, wearing a dark suit and an expression no one could decipher. "I'm resigning from the presidency of Harris Corporation," he announced, straightforwardly. A murmur of astonishment spread through the room. The directors exchanged confused glances. "James, this is crazy," one of them exclaimed. "You've dedicated your whole life to this company. And now my life is no longer here." There was silence. The weight of his words fell over everyone. James continued, "Besides, I'm donating part of my fortune to charities." This time, the shock was even greater. That was James Harris, the man who never gave anything to anyone, the ruthless businessman, strategist, and calculating figure. And now he was throwing it all away. But James didn't see this as losing. He saw it as the only way to show Sarah that none of it mattered without her. The decision made headlines in the newspapers. The whole city was talking about his resignation and his $1 million donation. But the only person he wanted to understand, the reason behind it, remained silent. Nothing was enough. Nothing made her change her mind. When the final week arrived, James no longer knew what to do. The divorce was scheduled for a few days later. His body was exhausted, his mind in tatters. He no longer slept, no longer ate. Every corner of that house reminded him of her. That night he sat on the porch with a bottle of whiskey, staring at the empty sky. "What do I do, Sarah?" he whispered into the void. But there was no answer, and perhaps there never would be again. James was living his last days in hell. The divorce was scheduled, and time was relentlessly ticking away, pushing him toward an abyss from which he might never escape. Since Sarah had left him, he was no longer the same man. He had lost everything that mattered. He no longer slept, didn't eat properly. His body was showing signs of exhaustion, and the pain inside him grew with each passing moment. He tried to find solutions, any way to reverse what was about to happen, but nothing worked. Sarah was unyielding. Throughout the week, he tried to reach her. He sent flowers, wrote handwritten letters, left long messages on her phone, hoping that at some point she would listen to at least one. But all he received was silence. He waited at her workplace for hours, hoping he could at least see her, that he could say something, convince her to give him a minute. But every time she left the building and their eyes met, she simply looked away and walked on. Had her love died? The question hammered in his mind every night. She had loved him so much. How could that have changed? But then the truth hit him like a sharp blade. It wasn't the love that had died. It was the trust. And trust, once broken, was almost impossible to regain. But he had to try. That night, James had an idea. If this was the last gesture he could make to show his love, it would be unforgettable. He booked the same restaurant where he had proposed to her, the place where she cried when she agreed to become his wife. He arranged to have the entire hall prepared just for the two of them. He had candles scattered on the floor, red rose petals everywhere, soft music playing in the background. He created the perfect setting for a new memory. He prepared the table with her favorite dish, chose the wine that Sarah always said she loved. Every detail was thought out to show that all he wanted was a second chance. Then he picked up the phone and called. She answered after the third ring. "Sarah." His voice trembled. He took a deep breath before continuing. "I know you don't want to hear me, but give me this last chance. Come to the restaurant, just us." Silence. James closed his eyes, waiting. "If, after this, you still want to leave me, I won't insist anymore," he added, feeling a lump in his throat. Sarah didn't respond, but he still had hope. He put on an impeccable suit and went to the restaurant, waiting. He waited. and waited. The clock struck 7, then 8, 9, 10. Sarah didn't show up. Every minute that passed was a blow to his chest. Every door that opened and wasn't her, a new wound in his soul. Finally, James accepted it. She no longer wanted to believe in him. He left the restaurant and drove aimlessly through the dark streets of the city. The pain was unbearable. The woman he loved had given up on him. But James didn't know how to give up. He went to the house where Sarah was staying. The rain poured down heavily, as if the sky itself felt his anguish. He knocked on the door, not caring that he was drenched. "Sarah, please listen to me." No response. "I know I made mistakes. I know I hurt you, but let me fix this." Nothing. He fell to his knees, water streaming down his face, mixing with the tears he didn't try to hold back. "I love you. I love you, Sarah. I've never loved anyone the way I love you." The door finally opened. Sarah was there, barefoot, her eyes red, her face marked by suffering. She was also broken. James tried to stand, grabbed her arm, but she recoiled. "Sarah, please." She closed her eyes, took a deep breath, trying to gather strength. Then, with a trembling voice, she said only one sentence, "It's too late." And she closed the door. James stayed there in the rain, on his knees, and he knew he had lost her. The next morning, the weight of reality hit him hard. The divorce was the next day. It was the end. He spent the day without speaking to anyone. There was nothing left to do. For the first time in his life, James Harris was defeated. That night, he sat in silence on the porch, just waiting for time to pass. The next day, he arrived early at the courthouse. He wore a black suit, but felt as though he was going to a funeral. Sarah had not arrived yet. He looked at the clock. Only a few minutes left. And then he saw something. Across the street, Sarah was walking slowly, lost in her thoughts, and she didn't see the car speeding toward her. "Sarah!" James shouted, his heart stopping. Time seemed to slow down. James saw the car speeding toward them, the driver distracted, and the cruel fate acting without mercy. His heart stopped for a moment when he realized that Sarah hadn't noticed the danger. Without thinking, he acted. His body moved before his mind could process what was happening. He ran faster than he had ever run before. "Sarah!" he shouted with all his strength. She turned her face, her eyes wide with fear, but it was already too late. James reached her just in time. He pushed her forcefully out of the way, and then he felt the impact. His body was hit with brutal force, thrown aside as if he weighed nothing. He heard the deafening sound of bones breaking. The pain came quickly and devastatingly, tearing through every part of him. Sarah fell to the ground, stunned. The impact of the fall scraped her knees against the asphalt, but she didn't feel the pain. Her heart was pounding so hard she could barely breathe. The sound of tires screeching, the crash of James's body hitting the car's hood and being thrown several meters away echoed in her mind in slow motion. She didn't want to look, but she did, and her world collapsed. James was lying in the street, motionless. Blood slowly spread around him. "No!" Sarah screamed, her voice echoing with pure panic. Her legs gave out as she tried to stand, and she almost fell again as she ran toward him. "James, talk to me!" She knelt beside him, her trembling hands trying to hold him without knowing where to touch. The blood. There was so much blood. He didn't react. His chest rose and fell slowly, but his eyes were closed, his face pale, his features marked by pain. People started to gather around them, murmuring words Sarah couldn't understand. Her world had narrowed down to James. She cupped his face in her hands, her whole body trembling. "Stay with me. Please, stay with me." The ambulance sirens sounded in the distance, but to Sarah, it felt miles away. Time passed, but she didn't know if there was still time. When the paramedics arrived, she had to move away, but she couldn't let go of his hand. "Will he be okay?" she asked, Her voice choked as the medics evaluated his injuries. No one answered. James was placed on a stretcher, and Sarah never let go of his hand. She climbed into the ambulance with him, tears flowing down her face, her fingers holding his, as if she could keep him tethered to reality. "Please, James, don't leave me." He remained motionless, his chest rising and falling slowly, but he didn't speak. The ambulance rushed through the city streets at full speed, and each minute felt like an eternity. Sarah barely blinked. Her body shook, her mind repeating just one thought. He saved my life, and now he might lose his. When they arrived at the hospital, the doctors ushered her away. Sarah stood still in the hallway, watching as he disappeared behind the double doors of the emergency room. And then she collapsed. The pain came in waves, crushing everything inside her. She grabbed onto the wall, her body weak, sobs escaping uncontrollably. Hours passed. Each minute was torture. Every time someone entered or exited the hallway, her heart would race. She sat down, curled up with her trembling hands covering her face. She was losing James. The thought of living without him was unbearable. It wasn't until much later, when the night had fallen, that a doctor finally appeared. "He's stable." Sarah didn't know if it was her body or her soul that relaxed first. She stood up too quickly, the world blurring for a moment. "Can I see him?" "He's still weak, but you can go in." Sarah took a deep breath before pushing open the door to the room. James was there, alive. His face was pale, a bandage wrapped around his forehead, and an IV drip hung beside him. But he was breathing. Sarah approached slowly, her heart pounding. His eyes were closed. She sat beside the bed and gently took his hand. Then he stirred. James's eyes slowly opened. When he saw Sarah there, his gaze softened. She smiled through her tears. "You're awake." He tried to speak, but his voice was hoarse and weak. Sarah breathed deeply, trying to hold back her sobs. And then, after all the silence, the words that had been trapped inside her came out. "Why did you risk your life for a bet?" James was silent for a moment. His eyes met hers, and he knew there was no running from the truth. He smiled faintly, tired but sincere. "Because I love her with all my heart." Sarah felt something inside her break, or perhaps something was being rebuilt. The past still hurt, but in that moment, she saw the truth in his eyes. He loved her, and he always had. Sarah didn't leave the hospital for a single moment. In the first days after the accident, she refused to leave his side, as though she feared that if she stepped away, something worse would happen. Every beep of the machines, every movement of the doctors, every labored breath from James made her heart tighten. She had already lost trust in him, but she couldn't lose him forever. The memory of the moment he threw himself to save her never left her mind. He acted without thinking, without hesitation, without calculating the consequences, because he loved her. And now, there, in the hospital, amidst the scent of medicine and white sheets, Sarah realized that, despite everything, she still loved him too. The pain of betrayal was still there. The past still weighed heavily on her, but what she felt for him hadn't died. James slept most of the time, still weak. Sarah spent her nights sitting by his side, holding his hand, watching his chest rise and fall, as if she wanted to make sure he was still there. One night, when the moon barely illuminated the dark room, she couldn't hold it in any longer. She held his hand tighter, brought his fingers to her lips, and whispered the words that had been trapped inside her for so long. "I love you too." In an instant, James opened his eyes. She held her breath. She didn't know he had been awake. His eyes were heavy, tired, but there was something in them, a raw emotion, genuine, a mix of surprise and hope. Sarah felt tears roll down her face. "You..." James tried to speak, but his voice was weak. She nodded, squeezing his hand. She didn't need to say more. At that moment, she knew she couldn't leave him. The next day, while James slept, Sarah took out her phone and sent a message to her lawyer. Cancel the divorce. The moment she pressed send, she felt the weight lift from her shoulders. It wouldn't be easy, but she wanted to try. When James woke up, he found Sarah sitting next to him, and this time, there was a different sparkle in her eyes. "How are you feeling?" she asked softly. "Alive," he murmured, trying to smile. Sarah hesitated for a moment, then took his hand and intertwined her fingers with his. "I cancelled the divorce." The air left James's chest as if he had been struck. For a moment he thought he had heard wrong. "What?" "I want to try, James, but this time it has to be real. No lies, no bets, no hidden motives." His eyes brightened, and before he could stop it, tears began to fall. He kissed her hand against his lips, closing his eyes, allowing himself to feel the depth of that moment. "I promise, I'll spend the rest of my life proving that you are the best thing that has ever happened to me." Sarah smiled, still crying. For the first time in a long while, she wasn't afraid. James's recovery was slow, but he was never alone. Sarah was with him at every physical therapy session, holding his hand when he felt pain. And above all, she was there because she wanted to be. Each day was a new chance to rebuild what they had broken, and little by little, they were succeeding. When James was finally discharged, it was Sarah who helped him into the car, who held his hand as they drove back home. And when he finally stepped into the mansion that had once felt so lonely, he no longer felt that emptiness. Now, she was there. A few weeks later, James did something he hadn't planned. In the living room, while Sarah was organizing some books on the shelf, he stood up slowly and walked over to her. "Sarah," he called, his voice firm. She turned, smiling softly. "What's wrong?" He kneeled. Sarah gasped, her heart racing. James pulled a small box from his pocket, opening it with trembling hands. "I asked you this before, but back then I was an idiot who didn't understand what I had in my hands. Now I'm asking you for real." Sarah covered her mouth, tears welling in her eyes. "Will you marry me again, this time for love?" She didn't hesitate. "Yes." James stood up, and before he could place the ring on her finger, she pulled him into a kiss full of love, redemption, and everything they had never said in words. This time, there was nothing between them except the purest feeling they had ever shared. It was real, and it would be forever. The sun gently poured over the garden of James's house, casting a golden glow on the leaves of the trees. It was a new beginning. Sarah stood there, wearing a simple white dress made of light fabric, while a soft breeze gently swayed her loose hair. This time, there was no luxury, no influential guests, no status, just the two of them and the love that after so many trials had survived. James stood before her, holding her hands firmly. His eyes gazed at her with devotion, reflecting everything that words couldn't express. This time, he was there entirely. "I never thought I'd be here, renewing our vows," James said, his voice filled with emotion. "But now, I know this is the only place I should be." Sarah smiled softly, her heart pounding with intensity. "And I never thought I could forgive, but I've learned that true love is stronger than the past." They exchanged simple but sincere vows. There was no need for grand speeches. They had already been through everything necessary to prove their love. When James slid the ring on her finger, Sarah felt a warmth fill her chest. This time, there were no lies. There was no game. When he kissed her, sealing their new promise, there was no doubt that they belonged to each other. The days that followed were light, filled with smiles and precious moments, but Sarah still carried scars. Some pains don't vanish overnight. There were days when, upon waking, a shadow from the past still weighed on her heart. But James was always there. He loved her differently now, with patience, with gratitude, with the certainty that she was the most precious thing he had ever had in his life. Sarah learned that to truly love someone also means to forgive. James never gave her reasons to doubt again. Every day, he proved that the man who had hurt her no longer existed. He cherished every moment by her side. He learned to admire the woman Sarah had always been, beyond appearances, beyond circumstances. He finally understood that true love is the connection between souls. Time passed, and they built a family together. The house that once seemed large and empty was now filled with the sounds of laughter, footsteps running through the halls, stories told at dusk. James was a present father, a devoted husband, a man completely transformed by love. The difficulties still existed. No life was perfect. But Sarah and James proved that love can overcome any obstacle. The past no longer defined them. One evening, while sitting on the balcony, gazing at the starry sky, James held Sarah's hand and looked into her eyes. "Thank you for staying." She smiled, gently squeezing his fingers. "I've always been here." And so, they lived the rest of their lives,